Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
We're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Last week, the Education Ministry announced a staggered approach to the reopening of public schools from the 24th of June, beginning with exam year students in Form 5 and Upper 6. Now, what are the lessons that Malaysia can learn from other countries as schools across the world start to also reopen? Joining us on the line now to provide a global perspective, we have Stefania Gianninni, Assistant Director General for Education for UNESCO, which I'm sure you know stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Welcome to the show, Stefania. Can we begin by first getting perhaps a better understanding of how UNESCO works with national governments in terms of their education systems? What is that relationship between UNESCO and countries?
Thank you very much. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Talking from Paris. And let me say that we are still putting the pieces of the puzzle all together. But we can say already that some lessons have been learned so far in this post-COVID-19 crisis, which had a huge impact on education. As you know, from the very beginning, we could say, as UNESCO monitoring the school closure, that at some point 1.6 billion students were out of school because of the crisis. So let me say that the school closures don't affect equally everyone. There are many factors into play, into action, such as home environment, support from caregivers, teachers' preparation or not, and of course, basically, as the traditional classroom moved overnight somehow to virtual one, access to devices and connectivity. So beyond these schools, closure, the main issue is that the crisis will amplify inequality. This is the main topic that UNESCO immediately stressed. And as you know, we are the UN agency in charge of monitoring and coordinating SDG 4, which is quality and inclusive education for all. So our main commitment is to put all our partners together within a global coalition we launched on 26th March, from the very beginning of the crisis, in order to give solutions to governments in terms of connectivity, in terms of other kind of tools when connectivity is not there, like radio, TV channels, in order to assure that the majority of students could be reached and can have this huge gap of education filled. Our claim, let me say, is a very simple one. Learning never stops. Continuity of learning for us is the main issue. So UNESCO is doing definitely two main kind of job in this situation. Monitoring the process, collecting data, and on the basis of an evidence-based analysis, giving government support and solution, also in this phase, which is much more about reopening schools and challenges that are there, of course.
Stefania, if I could come back to the question of, if you could give us a more granular look at how UNESCO might work with the national government, if you have a sense of how UNESCO works with Malaysia, for instance. Who are your partners? Is it merely a state issue and member states, or is it also about CSOs and NGOs? Do they give you information about the situation in Malaysia? And what is the process of negotiating that relationship?
Well, let me say, this is really the very first global crisis. And it's an health crisis. It's about the virus affecting 100,000 of people around the world, now millions, I should say, in terms of contamination. But the impact on other sectors like education has been already very much impressive. So the first lessons learned is about a strong need of a new kind of solidarity and partnership. And UNESCO role has been from the very beginning putting around the table not only, she said, our traditional partners like UNICEF, like World Bank, all the UN system, but as it is a real collective responsibility to guarantee continuity of learning to all children in the world, and to make all efforts we can do in order to support government, especially in the most fragile regions, to reach the most fragile and vulnerable population of students. We were reached from big companies, high-tech companies like Microsoft, like Zoom, like Moodle, like Facebook, and they discussed with us how they could provide their support, not of course from their business perspective, but in the new kind of solidarity mood and taking their own part of responsibility.
Okay.
And that's why UNESCO from the very beginning organized this coalition I mentioned, which is about private sector, UN, and civil society, which is another NGOs, as you mentioned, which are on the ground, and they immediately could give us some clear indications of the needs. And with the private sector, we agreed with some basic principles that I want to underline, because for us, the values and non-negotiable conditions, transparency of data, and everything to be done for free, and zero rate for connectivity. So it's about really choosing a new kind of moving together in an unprecedented and uncharted territory.
Okay, well,
and the second...
Yes, sorry. Please continue, yes.
No, just to say a concrete example that can really give the sense of what we are doing. In some countries of the West African Francophone region, like Senegal, for instance, from the very beginning, as their student population didn't have immediate access to connectivity and devices from home, we organized with the Ministry of Education a policy plan in order to integrate with e-learning platforms other kind of resources. Like
Stefania, that's very interesting. I want to continue this conversation about the digital divide. We're going to take a quick break, but let's come back to this. And we're just going to continue our conversation with Stefania in just a few minutes. So make sure you stay with us on Consider This. Watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan. We're speaking to Stefania Gianninni, Assistant Director General for Education for UNESCO. Stefania, coming back to our conversation a little bit earlier, I'm sure, as countries around the world are starting to reopen schools, that UNESCO has been monitoring the progress of these countries very closely. What are some of the lessons, Stefania, that Malaysia can learn from other countries that have embarked on the reopening of schools?
I think that what you can see globally, this is the added value of looking at this global crisis from a global observatory. We see that still the priority for governments in order to decide when we open schools, of course, is the health dimension, and be sure that schools can take measures as social distancing between students, as a lot of guidance that can be done easily sometimes from little children to university students about wash washing hands frequently, and everything. But immediately after that, what is important that we can go back to the role of school as the social, the most important social dimension, where children coming out from their own family, network, and community can find a lot of things that are not simply and exclusively learning content, but it's about nutrition, it's about, in many countries, security conditions, it's about, for girls, for instance, I don't think it's the case of Malaysia, but for many countries, girls are more exposed to, drop out after this crisis, and violence, exploitation, everything that is about taking the school system as a very clear center of the community again. So this is the main lesson that I think we can share with all the governments and school educators in the world, including Malaysian authorities.
Stefania, can you give us a sense of the impact of the pandemic as it might have been uneven across the world? A lot of the cases happen in urban centers, where we look at deaths and morbidity rates, but rural areas perhaps much more distant. Schools might have very few students, in fact, and not packed and dense as urban schools. Is there any information about the difference between rural and urban, different countries, very populous countries and those are not? What stories can we tell, do you have for us from around the world?
Well, as I said from the beginning, this crisis is not affecting equally all countries and all student communities. Of course, the very first challenge has been not being able to connect immediately when the only solution to fill the gap of education was connectivity and e-learning. I just mentioned some numbers, maybe some interesting to know and share with our people interested to education. I mean, globally, we know that almost half of the students' population don't have access to internet from home. But if we look at regional data, we see that in African countries, this percentage reached numbers like 80, 82%. If we look at Europe, we see that this percentage decreased to reach an average European not connectivity around 14%. So you can imagine that rural zones in African countries, sub-Saharan region, has been challenged from the very beginning. And this is the very first concrete data I can tell you. Then, if you look at teachers were not prepared to jump from traditional classroom to virtual ones. We had a survey in UNESCO, it's around 60 countries, and 2/3 of teachers said, guys, we are not prepared with the right skills to move from the traditional learning process to the virtual ones. But if you look at regional situations, you see that still in Latin American rural zones and sub-Saharan, mostly West Coast and Francophone region, these numbers increased. So it's still a question of increasing inequality.
Stefania, I'm wondering if there is a gendered dimension to perhaps the impact of school closures on students. Are girls more disadvantaged than boys?
Yes. With our data were very clear from the very beginning. We are still collecting. We are publishing some more, deep diving through the gender lens. But from the very beginning, we can say that in terms of dropout after the crisis, for sure, girls will be more affected than boys. In terms of digital skills, girls were already a bit more behind than boys, and maybe this crisis is not sure, but could increase this digital divide. So we have to fill this gap. We have to work on teachers and policy plans to focus very much on digital divide for girls. Third dimension is the more should say, social and cultural one. As I said before, in some countries, early marriages, early pregnancies are still a real word. And within this crisis and in the post-crisis, for sure, these processes are supposed to increase.
All right. Okay, we're going to take another break and more with Stefania in just a few minutes. So stay tuned to Consider This. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Stefania Gianninni, Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO. Stefania, I'm wondering whether this crisis presents us an opportunity for us to perhaps rethink the way we've been doing education all these decades. What do you think?
I think so. I think so. You know, crisis means that it's time, the ancient Greek word, where the word counts, means that it's time to separate, to distinguish, to see clearly, and to decide. And deciding about the future of education is a very popular topic at UNESCO. We launched a big initiative last year about the futures of education. But now we can say the future is now. The future is the present situation. So two key words I want to mention: reimagining the way we learn and we teach, capitalizing and leveraging technology, but also not forgetting the role of socio-emotional component of learning and teaching. And these 3 months, more or less, of schools shut down said very much about the importance of the physical and human dimension. And a second key word is about reforming the school systems. It's about being brave, being courageous, and also from the UN system. You know, we have SDG 4, inclusive quality education for all. Now we have to capitalize to unlock creativity and to valorize innovation, because we saw very many maybe small projects which can become flagships in the near future.
Stefania, I want to ask you, we had somebody from the state of Sabah on our show some weeks ago talking about the fact that kids weren't going to school wasn't necessarily a bad thing in some rural sectors, because the kids were learning or relying on older generations to learn old skills. They were going back to their traditions. They were, enjoying the environment. There were many things that were not about connectivity, but were about the resources already attendant in those communities. Is UNESCO thinking about that? I mean, is it all about high-speed connectivity? What about older skills and older ways of relating and educating oneself?
I think that UNESCO, as the house of cultural diversity and the house of education as a basic human right, will valorize much and more than ever the role of, let me say, traditional way to learn and to teach in the post-COVID-19. Technology replacing the human dimension is not our business. And I think that this crisis is clearly showcasing how and to what extent, when the more you have to leverage technology, the better you can valorize traditional way to learn and teach. And children coming now to school, maybe for some a few weeks in Europe, some countries already reopened. This is the case of France, for instance. And they're already going back and getting back to the importance of drawing, the importance of being together in the same room and sharing, the human dimension once again. And I think that is one of the other lessons learned.
I think that's quite interesting that you brought that up, Stefania. I want to ask you about active learning, where students are involved in their own learning for 21st century skills, creative thinking and critical thinking. How is active learning going to be encouraged in schools now in this kind of post-COVID era, given the confines of new safe distancing SOPs? Will students be allowed to work in groups and on group projects and the like? What do you think?
So, I think that there will be increasingly a focus and attention on team building in learning and teaching, as this process of e-learning, when it's been implemented correctly, that means not simply putting some papers on the screen, but building the virtual classroom as a real community, can really give some very important lessons about this process. Our children, our young people generation now are very much linked to these devices, right? And they do everything in terms of from love to learning about through that. So now this integrated system that we are obliged to put in practice almost overnight can become a new platform to valorize the real e-learning dimension, which is not simply, as I said, replacing teachers with devices or written tests and drawing with screens.
Right. Stefania, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us tonight. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for this evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.